Mitrao, Namaskar. Welcome to this book release and discussion program of the Pune International Center. I am Abhay Vaidya, Director PIC. The chair for today's event, Shri Kumar Gedkar, Padma Shri, eminent journalist, member of Rajya Sabha, and founder member of Pune International Center. Dr. Ajit Ranade, noted economist, Vice Chancellor of Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, and trustee, Pune International Center. Professor Pradeep Apte, Emeritus Professor Savitribai Phule, Pune University, and Senior Research Fellow, Pune International Center. Shri Bhanu Kare, eminent writer, founder editor of the popular Marathi magazine Antarnaad, founder editor of the quarterly Change for Better, and the author of the book which is being released today. And Shri Govind Joshi, who has been associated with the Shetkari Sangatna for about 4 decades and is executive president of the Shetkari Sangatna Trust. आपण हा कार्यक्रम मराठीत केला असता, पण मुख्यतः 2 कारणांमुळे आपण हा इंग्रजीत करत आहोत. एक तर हे पुस्तक इंग्रजीत आहे आणि स्वर्गीय शरदभाऊ जोशींचे विचार इंग्रजीतनं अगदी लांबपर्यंत पोचावे म्हणून आपण हा इंग्रजीत करत आहोत. India is an agrarian nation, and the first thing that comes to mind is how do we understand India without understanding our farmers and Indian agriculture? And the second thing is how do we understand Indian agriculture without appreciating the crusade and the issues raised by Sri Sharad Joshi. Sharad Joshi was born in Satara, did higher education in Mumbai, worked in some places in India before moving to Switzerland at the Universal Postal Union, returned to Pune, and India, or should we say Bharat, became his karma bhumi. He recognized that there were in fact 2 Indias which exist. And today's panel discussion, aptly titled by Shri Bhanu Kare, is Sharad Joshi, the man who introduced Bharat to India. Many distinguished members of this gathering, be they activists, journalists, academicians, policy makers, or supporters and admirers, knew Sharad Joshi personally. Since Pune was his base, I, like many other journalists, used to interact with him off and on, be it at press conferences or at some agitation here and there, or at some public function in Tilak Smarak Mandir, or at his residence at Ambedhan in Chakan. He always gave us good headlines and good copy. His single point agenda was remunerative price for farm produce because he saw the acute mismatch between cost of production and the money that the farmers earned. This pained him deeply. Sharad Joshi led many agitations, and many of these were novel and deliberately so because he didn't want to be predictable in what he did. We will of course hear more from our distinguished speakers, and before I hand over the floor, I want to say a few words about Pune International Center, which is now in its 11th year. If you see the logo of PIC, you will see that there is a churning, and this churning is of thoughts and ideas. In the words of PIC's president, Dr. Raghunath Mashilkar, Pune International Center is a Vichar Manthan Kendra. It is an independent, multifaceted think tank which seeks to foster the values enshrined in the Indian Constitution and which seeks to promote liberal thought, an environment for free and fair public debates, and provide a platform to promote the arts and culture. PIC works closely with the younger generation to promote innovative, inclusive, and progressive thinking in all fields of public life. This think tank is funded by its 450 members, most of them Punekars. PIC is led by Dr. Mashilkar as President and Dr. Vijay Kelkar as Vice President. This center works in the areas of national security, energy, environment and climate change, social innovation, science, technology, innovation and national growth, and economic reforms and urbanization. From time to time, PIC interacts closely with the Maharashtra government, the central government, notably the Ministries of Defence and External Affairs, and Niti Aayog. Presently, two members of PIC are in the Rajya Sabha, Shri Kumar Ketkar, who is with us, and Dr. Narendra Jadhav. Just a few months ago, the Maharashtra government sanctioned a 3-hectare plot to the PIC at Pasham, and in a few years from now, PIC will have its campus there. On this happy note, I would like to invite Shri Govind Joshi, the Executive President, Shetkari Sangatna Trust, to take the floor and say a few words.
Good evening, every one of you, and welcome. And I thank you for being with us on the occasion of this release of the book authored by our Bhanu Kale. This is a book on Sharad Joshi, who was a liberal committed farm leader, who gave an economic paradigm to agriculture, one of the most innovative political thinkers. Himself a prolific writer in Marathi and English. I, as an executive trustee of the Shetkari Sangatna Trust, take an opportunity and privilege to extend a warm welcome to the eminent dignitaries on the dais, Honorable Shri Kumar Ketkar, eminent journalist and chairperson of this event. Guest speaker, Honorable Dr. Ajit Ranade, Vice Chancellor, Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. Another guest speaker, Honorable Professor Pradeep Apte, Professor Emeritus, Savitribai Phule Pune University. It's a matter of great pleasure, rather a matter of great satisfaction for us that the function of releasing and reviewing, I would say the reviewing the book, the biography of Honorable late Sharad Joshi, is being graced by the learned dignitaries from diverse fields. I must thank the dignitaries for honoring the invitation given to them. I think I should also thank the Pune International Center for that they have invited them. On this occasion, I just recollect a recent incident about the speech delivered by Shri Ajit Ranade on some occasion at Nagpur. It is almost related to the principal lines and the legacy of Sharad Joshi. He openly criticized and came down hard on the government for their decision of banning and restricting the exports of wheat and sugar. He very distinctly elaborated as to how the decision is harmful for the farmers alone and beneficial for none. And how the government's every now and then stance or commitment of doubling the farmers' income is deceitful. This is a very rare and encouraging against the backdrop of most of the scholars and eminent economists and erudites refusing to accept and even recognizing the very fact. Mr. Bhanu Kale, we the trustees are sincerely thankful to Sri Bhanu Kale for the painstaking efforts that he has taken before authoring this book and earlier published the Marathi version of the same. It was a critical task rather, searching, researching, collecting the information scattered all over the country and abroad. He played rather a very crucial role in carrying forward the legacy of Sharad Joshi. And it is one of the major objective of the Shetkari Sangatna Trust. I must essentially thank Honorable Sri Abhay Vaidya, Chief and Administrative Officer, Pune International Center, and the office bearers of Pune International Center for extending their cooperation to hold this event. I also thank the trustees. They will not like it, but I would thank them for being here with us. I once again thank the audience and say goodbye. I don't wish to keep you people waiting for the eminent speakers who are going to be here now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sri Govind Bhau Joshi. I now request the chairperson for this evening, Mr. Kumar Ketkar, to kindly release the book, Sharad Joshi, Leading Farmers to the Center Stage. Thank you. I shall now request the chair for today's event, Sri Kumar Ketkar, to kindly initiate the panel discussion on the theme, Sharad Joshi, the man who introduced Bharat to India. Our panelists are Mr. Bhanu Kaye, eminent writer and author of the book Sharad Joshi, Leading Farmers to the Center Stage. Dr. Ajit Ranade, noted economist and Vice Chancellor of Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, and Professor Pradeep Apte, Professor Emeritus, Savitribai Phule Pune University. Over to you, Mr. Ketkar.
At the outset, I must thank Pune International Center and personally Sri Bhanu Kaye and my friends, comrades, Ajit Ranade and Pradeep Apte and others. Abhay Vaidya has been my journalist, fraternal community member in Times of India for many years, though we interacted more frequently after he joined PIC. Having said that, my responsibility to initiate the panel discussion on this book, I just asked him whether it is proper for me to sit here and or speak there. So the idea is that since it is a panel discussion, they have to speak from here. I will ask them to make their comments and observations and whatever point they want to make from here. At the time of closing remarks, frankly, I will go to the podium. So I do not want to take much of their time because I must say that the book is so painstakingly done, so research oriented. I had read Angarwata before, but this is slightly much added also. Much of the thing is added in this book. So, and it becomes more what you can call intellectual friendly, this particular book, than Angarwata. Angarwata is more reader friendly. This is in reader friendly as well as intellectual friendly. That doesn't mean Angarwata is not intellectual friendly. But because the lingua franca of the intellectual community in this country is essentially English, I think this book is a major contribution on the subject and the man. For a long time, Sharad Joshi was by and large neglected by the English-speaking media, English-writing media, certainly the TV, English TV media, and even the English intellectual community, even academic community. He used to make headlines, or not necessarily everyday headlines, but he used to make headlines. He also went to Rajya Sabha, and though it is going to be a little diverse from the topic, I must say that I entirely share his diffidence and disappointment with Rajya Sabha being there. He spent 6 years, I have spent 4 years already, and I have no intention to go back there because it will be additional, almost say, irrelevant and almost wasteful years because nothing happens there, particularly in this regime. Because neither the Prime Minister nor the Home Minister, nobody really comes to Parliament. They don't discuss. And when you see BBC, Prime Minister of Britain addressing and responding to any question, any time, during that week or that particular day, one wonders what is happening here. They don't come at all. Some of the bills they come, they get passed instantly because they want majority. They are repealed without getting discussion. So there is no discussion when passing the bill, and there is no discussion when repealing, as we all saw on the agricultural issue. Similarly, CAA, there was so much explosion all over the country, but the operational procedures are still not clear. Therefore, CAA is there and not there at the same time. So this is how, and 370 also, actually they are supposed to submit the bills in advance at least a week so that we study. And we suggest either some kind of suggestions there, some kind of recommendation, some kind of new provisions, or send it to standing committee, select committee, nothing happens, the bills get passed. So even 370 was just like that. So this is not a platform for making a political comment, but I am not making a political comment, because the book also contains critical comments on the functioning of Rajya Sabha, even at that time, that is during Vajpayee's time and VP Singh's time and so on and so forth. So I am just reiterating what Sharad Joshi said about the Rajya Sabha and its ineffectiveness. So with all that having said, which is also part of the book, so I am not really going away from the subject, I will ask, I think, Pradeep first. Pradeep incidentally was my comrade first. From comrade he shifted to center, from center to center right, and I shifted from not much, from comrade to center left, remaining partly with comrades, partly with center left, but essentially becoming Nehruvian. And becoming Nehruvian is not exactly a friendly posture politically, intellectually, with Sharad Joshi's views and Sharad Joshi's thoughts. But that hardly matters. I had met Sharad Joshi personally several times, but more as a journalist in the Economic Times. I met him in Lasalgaon, I met him in Chakar, and later on, there was a full-day seminar on Iron Rand, I was thinking, at Devrali in Leslie Sonny, where only two speakers were there for the first half of the day, myself and Sharad Joshi. That time I had interacted a lot with him. So some personal anecdotes also I have, but I don't want to go into that. The point is, my interaction with Sharad Joshi was not only as a journalist, but also as an interactive person, reacting to his thesis and movements. I covered his movement as a reporter. So for me, he was a subject, he was a hero or a villain, depending on which side you are. And I covered most of his agitations, including I was impressed with that Lakshmi Andolan. I was not greatly impressed with Paka Ganga Andolan, both I covered. But nevertheless, he made you think, that much you can say. He made you think, he made you revise whatever prejudices you have, or whatever convictions you have, or whatever ideological positions you have. He made you revisit them. And that was, I think, a great contribution, because that is what the democracy means, having genuine dialogue with diverse ideas from diverse people. With those words, I close my opening remarks and hand over it to my former comrade Pradeep Apte.
Thanks, Uma. I have rightly shifted to right. And there are reasons, and more compelling reasons, which you can find if you follow Sharad Joshi closely. This is a biography, and I will quickly give one or two comments on the biography per se, and then talk about Uh, there is a chapter which is at the end, which is in search of new things or new ideas, new ways. I would have loved if this chapter had been longer and more elaborate. Because perhaps this might be a biased comment, because Vijay Parulkar wrote a very expensive live coverage when Sharad Joshi was at his peak, which was called Yodha Shetkari. And a good part of that has already been known to the Marathi audience. Good that it is now known to the English audience. But I think the book is a little more favorably tilted in favor of those years which are actually covered in Yodha Shetkari. And I think that is not really a complete and a fair introduction to Sharad Joshi. Because I knew him as a friend. I was too young, and but he was always ever young. We met in Gokhale Institute, and I was a part of LIFT at that time, student union and all kinds of, including Lal Nishan Party with which Kumar had worked as long association. But he knew what my personal views were and what my many personal inclinations were. I was not a card holder, and we used to have a very frank discussion several times at his home in Sindha Colony, as well as in Gokhale Institute, as well as in Cafe Delight, which was in fact a more intellectual center in those days. Sharad Joshi was a person who you rightly mentioned about Ayn Rand. He was a person who advocated for the individual freedom and emphasized valued it greatly, but more in the sense of Ayn Rand rather than in the sense of Adam Smith. When you read Sharad Joshi closely, you can realize what I really mean by these differences. He was a person who was often very receptive to many new ideas, even though they appear half-hearted sometimes, half-baked sometimes, but he would pick it up and think of it differently. Very receptive to new ideas, new arguments, and you can talk to him on any subject. He was never confined to a very limited kind of ideas. Very long range of ideas with whom I have discussed. I remember when we travelled together to one of the Chandigarh convention that B.S. Maan had organized. We were discussing while going on the railway. We were discussing on what it means to have in binomial theorem. How many things one can read in binomial theorem. He was a good statistician. In fact, his BCom was with statistics as principal subject. So, very live person and extremely combative person. This Yodha Shetkari, the Yodha is equally applied to him as a person, because when he is discussing with you, he would always fight as if he is fighting. He was not really fighting, but his stance, his posture, his way of arguing used to be like a Yodha. And it was very interesting and engaging. That made the conversation a lot more live than it would otherwise be. So, I think the second half of Sharad Joshi's regime, because he increasingly realized when he started his agitation, we were with him at that time. I don't have many of those friends who are there. I don't find him. For example, Rajiv Masarekar and myself, we started a small weekly which was called Warkari. This was other than Shetkari Sangathan. So, in those times, the entire question of these conditions of peasantry and farmers in India was very heavily shadowed by the idea of what happens to terms of trade. And this had a very heavy influence of very old debate in the Marxist tradition, like Rosa Luxemburg, Preobrazinski, Bukharin. And as one knows, Stalin, in fact, in 1928 had, and again in 1932 had said that peasantry has to pay for building up of socialism. And it is a special kind of a tribute that they must pay, and they must pay it in form of taking away the grains from them. They should not complain. Yes, it is unjust. Stalin says that I am pained at this, but this is the only way in which we can build up socialism, because otherwise we don't have a colonies to exploit. So from where does the primitive accumulation needed for building up socialism can come from? So this kind of a notion that you have to find a colony, if not outside, you have to find it within, and that within colony probably most conveniently and always permanently available for a less developed country happens to be agriculture, and therefore you must plunder agriculture. And it was quite right in those times, because we were yet not as developed as we are today, and the kind of sources of capital which were found to be very scarce, lot more scarce than what we believe today. in the 50s, in the 60s, and also in the 70s. And therefore, Sharad Joshi's argument was naturally colored by these conditions, and it was shaped by the ideas of changing terms of trade. Gradually, he realized, and I think it was not all that gradual, though he publicly made it to be appearing much more gradual, because when we discussed it privately, he confessed, he admitted, yes, there are many more facets, but if you are leading an organization, if you want to wake up farmers, what explains their plight, what explains their wretched condition, you can't keep on, and he always used to call me you academicians or you professors, and much more so with an even greater sharp acidity, because I was a student of Dandekar, and as you know, these two personalities of similar character had a great friction even publicly. So much so that at one point of time, Dandekar said, Sharad Joshi, Bharat uddhat kaun se ho to? This is a live example of what is meant by pot calling the kettle black. So, but he was acutely aware that there is something more that he is doing which is great, but something more needs to be done. He didn't really raise this issue as a novel, as I have said, this has been an old issue in Marxist tradition as well as in several countries where this has been a practiced kind of a policy. But he persevered with that, but gradually he started expanding the vista, and you can see this in the slogans. Demand for freedom, demand for complete freedom appeared much later, but gradually it became the primary theme. And all this, the first slogan like Nako Bhi, but Have Kashta Se Dam, all this gradually became a war for the kind of freedom that the farmer and the farming sector should have. In this sense, Sharad Joshi happens to be, in fact, the first founder of demand for liberalization in agriculture. In spite of all the talk of liberalization that we have had for the last 30 years, there is no one who so openly, so candidly, and so fiercely asked for liberalization, which Sharad Joshi did. It is for this reason, I think, this last chapter, which I think is too thin, in order to portray what Sharad Joshi really meant, what he really wanted to argue, and the kind of vision that he had about Indian agriculture. And here are many sources of influence. You can see them. For example, in the, I suppose, Matresa Rai, Sita Shethi, Masgar Shethi, all these are the things which in fact reflect the receptivity that he have had about the way in which the farmer and the farmer's practice can be modified in terms of organization, in terms of operations, in terms of choice of technology. You can see the indirect influences of people like Sriyal Abolkar, who in fact said that you will minimize the inputs and you would be able to have much more guaranteed control output. That's something which was so well demonstrated with the grape growers. You can see all those influences in his writing. So I think he was gradually changing, and came an happy event called the conclusion of Uruguay. And the proposal of that, which was Dunkel Draft, and that brought us once again together. Because when he was busy with his agitation, we didn't used to meet that frequently. But Dunkel Draft gave an opportunity where we were a minority. We were a minority of 4. Because any seminar which was mostly centered around patent, unfortunately, not so much about the agriculture, but even that was so tilted in only one kind of an argument that someone saying that Dunkel Draft could be good, is good, and should be in fact considered in the light of many other things. Many people who didn't even know GATT became the experts on GATT, and the people who support the proposals in Dunkel Draft were very, very thin in number. To give you a number which we always shared among ourselves, we were 4 people who would be invited to speak in favor of Dunkel Draft, so much so that if one is not available, they would suggest remaining 3 as the possible names. One was Gail Amwit, other was Sharad Joshi, third was Vivek Devroy, and 4th was myself. We used to be the only champions speaking in favor of Dunkel Draft. In fact, I wrote a book called Dunkel Draft, Myth and Reality, which is in fact a result of those many speeches. And because of the milieu prevailing in those times, it is heavily biased and tilted in favor of decision on patents. But agriculture was one of the important elements there, and not many people really like to discuss this. Then came the idea that which he sees it as an opportunity, that he would start arguing for liberalizing agriculture in the sense of all kinds of freedoms that you need to do a business, and agriculture is a business and not the humbug called way of life. This was something for the most paid and liked theme of his, and he used to utter it so blatantly that probably it appeared very arrogant, and he used to ridicule people who used to glorify agriculture, saying that look, agriculture is not a business, it's a way of life, and so on and so forth. He used to blast that myth with a great vigor because that was his conviction, and his whole argument for freedoms is primarily the freedom to do business as and when the person engaged in that business finds it necessary. That those demands, which he in fact once again articulated, another period in which again we started interacting more heavily, he became the chairman of a task force, and in fact one day he called me and said, I think I should put it in Marathi. Oh, Professor, मिळालं का आमचं पत्र? म्हटलं हो मिळालं. या आम्हाला शहाणपण शिकवायला. And as it happened, we in fact traveled together to Delhi on the same plane. We were in fact together in the evening. Next day and after that, I told him that if I was not trying to educate you, but you have an honorable colleague with you in the task force, I think he will get educated. And that was Abhijit Singh, the CPM member at that time. I don't know, he would be still. So, I think he had a different vision of what it means to liberalize agriculture, from land markets to doing agriculture differently, to change in technology, various modes in which the value addition to the primary product derived from agriculture could be transformed, and the way it would be marketed. All these were the elements and facets with which he was always constantly engaged, and any idea that would in fact support this mode of thinking, he was always in search of that. A similar thing happened when we traveled, as I mentioned, Man had organized a huge rally in Punjab, in Chandigarh in fact, and it was a rather unusual event for me. First of all, I have never seen so many Sikhs at a time. And I was to speak in Hindi, and I told him that I'm comfortable with reading in Hindi or writing in Hindi, but I'm not comfortable in speaking in Hindi. He said, so in the case with me, don't worry. So I asked him, what do you do? जाता है तो मनोहर कहानियां वाचायचं म्हणजे बरोबर सुचतो. This is what his advice. So even and after that, I don't remember the year. There was a Karyakarani Samiti near Nagpur, Wardha. So in fact, he insisted that I should come there and address Karyakarani. So we were quite in tune with each other on several themes. There were several things on which we differed, but we were happy to differ because that made our conversations very lively. And I think Sharad Joshi needs to be given this deserving honor of introducing idea of liberalization in agriculture, which is still missing. And all those ideas, I will forget about what happened to those 3 laws, but remember, these 3 laws are something which was one of the major themes which probably was said by at least 80% of the people who gave witness to the task force. So much so that it was immediately after the task force in 2 years, the union government then had suggested a model law for reorganizing the agricultural marketing and scrapping the existing, which is still existing in some states. So the whole idea of reforming markets, agriculture markets, particularly the regulated markets as they were called and are still operative, this idea is something which is not really the recent one. It is a very old one. In fact, it was hatched and matured in Sharad Joshi's own time. In fact, you can read several articles of Sharad Joshi where he described the pathetic conditions in which the farmers appear in the so-called regulated market, where regulated market are supposed to have a very long list, and I know what that regulated market is. I was myself MSAMB member, and we used to plan and approve these markets. So there are several such reforms. For example, another thing which happened during the same time, the government of India, whichever party it is, has a habit of putting ban very quickly, whether it is exports, whether it is futures market. In those times, all of a sudden, some 8 commodities were selected and the future trade in those commodities were banned. One good outcome of the task force of Sharad Joshi was that in spite of being a CPM member, Abhijit Sen was the one who, in fact, opposed this idea of putting a ban on futures. So I said, "Amtashi Kodal, Kamaya." So that is Sharad Joshi, and I think this part of Sharad Joshi, which is much larger than being a very brilliant, and of course you are a great leader, he didn't say new things, but he said that in such a new way that it could move and mobilize the peasantry, that too in Maharashtra, with a person whose name happens to be, surname happens to be Joshi, where the tradition has been to say Joshane Bhavishya Sangave, but Joshane Bhavishya Shetita Sangita. This was a remarkable departure in the history of Maharashtra, and the kind of success and the following that have had is of course remarkable, and it is quite rightly reflected in your book. But I hope there will be a second edition, and I'm sure there will be a second edition. In that second edition, I think you should bring out those facets of Sharad Joshi, which are in fact less known, but probably over a period of time, they would become a lot more important, and probably you would have recorded the kind of honor, the kind of place of honor that he deserves in the evolution of policy thinking in India, particularly in the context of liberalization, where the liberalization happens to be somehow confined only to trade and services, which is not the case. And the nature of liberalization that India needs and deserves was probably first time brought on the agenda and inaugurated by this great leader, Sharad Joshi, a great friend of ours. He was a friend of the time we don't meet for a long time, but the first question we would ask each other, "Kai sadhya kai vasle?" He was a person who was always receptive and open to so many ideas in so many fields. And it was really delightful to meet him anytime. Even when he was not so well, it was a great event to meet Sharad Joshi. So thank you for calling me here to say a few words about the great friend of mine, whom I have enjoyed so many events and so many valuable events to understand and enrich myself intellectually. Thank you.
I have thoughtfully changed the sequence of speakers because Bhanu has written the book. So I did not want him to elaborate on what he has written. I wanted him to first listen to the comments made by the critics or readers or experts and then respond in that context to how he wrote and what he missed and what he did not want to miss but had to miss or whatever. So that's why I have put him as the last of the panelists in this particular sequence. So now I will request Ajit Ranade to speak.
Thank you and good evening everybody. Thank you to Mr. Bhanu Kale for writing this book, in fact writing the second book, the Marathi and the English translation. Thank you for PIC for organizing this book release event. Thank you for inviting me, and of course I'm very happy that I'm sharing the dais with Pradeep Apte, Govinda Joshi, Kumar Ketkar, all of whom of course have been serious students of the kind of issues that Sharad Joshi dealt with or lived with, and you all know him personally. I was fortunate to meet Mr. Sharad Joshi a few times only, so not as much as some of the others here would have known, or people in the audience. And I was struck by the fact that he was, as Pradeep said, even in the few encounters that I've had, he was very direct, no room for formalities, niceties, straight away start talking about the subject or about the issue, ask frank questions as if you know each other for a long time. That was something that struck me. He would be, by the way, 87 this year. In a couple of months, he would have been 87. And 87 is not such an old age in modern times. And we badly miss him in these times of when agriculture reformed and laws have been passed. So I think his commentary and his sharp insight would have been very, very useful and very insightful and very, very crucial for the nation, I would say. There are so many things I'm trying to organize my disparate thoughts. So it's really, there's no substitute for reading the book. I would strongly recommend that it's very easily readable. It's a very you will do it in one sitting, hopefully. What I want to say is that I've noticed that especially among Indian authors, I think maybe it's global, but certainly among Indian authors and writing about contemporary economic or business history, it's difficult to see authors who write about personalities without it sort of degenerating into an hagiography. Uh, and I must say that this book is exceptional in that sense that it is not a hagiography. It is something that someone of the stature of Mr. Bhanu Kale has written with great amount of scholarship, great amount of study, great amount of really painstaking work, including contacting Mr. Joshi's colleague in Switzerland. You know, there's this dark period, as he calls it, in Mr. Joshi's life, that not much is known. So he actually took the pains to contact people who had come in contact with, to find out more about it. And then since you have known, I think you knew him for almost 20 years, maybe 25 years. So it's very easy that if you know such a person at close quarters and you meet frequently and you have long discussions, very, very stimulating discussions, it would have been very easy for the book to have become a hagiography. Because not just because of extraordinary personality of Sharad Joshi. So sometimes you have to expose the what I may call the warts and the flaws in the person. I think that's the purpose of the book is not to expose the flaw, but it's just that a very honest appraisal. So I think that is really an exceptional, among many other qualities in the book. I find it very exceptional because you read about the person. Of course, you feel empathy about the person. You feel that you understand this person, and yet it is not just hagiography. It's a proper biography. So thank you for doing that. Secondly, of course, we can talk about the person, but today's occasion actually is to also talk about the book. Because some of the qualities that come through is that, for example, Mr. Joshi he appeared for the Union Public Service exam. And then while they were waiting for he badly needed a job, of course, livelihood. And he had applied for Bombay University. And while he was waiting, Professor Bhanange persuaded him to come to Kolhapur for the first commerce college which was being set up, and he would have been one of the founder professors there. And the Bombay University decision had not come. So he accepted their offer. But before he could join that college, the Bombay University offer also came through, which was his first choice, which would have actually meant much more in terms of his career growth and his, who knows, future trajectory in his life. So, because he had given a word that he would join Kolhapur, he kept his word. And he went to Kolhapur, which in those days, I know Kolhapur is a big city, but it's not Bombay. And it surely affected the course of his life. And so this is one thing that it struck me, that this little small incident, it may seem small, but it's quite big, that you keep your word and you go there. And that's where he first, I think, got exposed to these students who, many of them came from rural areas. They were not comfortable in English. They wanted to be, he could see them at very close quarters, and he had great empathy for the students. In fact, some of his other writings, perhaps they are not captured fully in this English translation. Some of it is in your Marathi, the kind of letters he wrote, or the detailed, those, we are talking about Sharad Joshi as a radical thinker, activist, farmer, the person who influenced India's farmer policies or thinking about farmers. But please don't forget these other aspects of his life, that this empathy for students. There is one incident that you relate where he's sitting in the restaurant and the waiter says, "Me Khandekar." So he looks at him, realize he's a student. And actually, he's a waiter. He's become a waiter. So that really moved him to tears. So this is really the aspect which comes through, and it's very vividly described. That's one. Another incident which also struck me, it's not an incident, it's a facet of his life, that this person had no connection with farming. Maybe till the age of 30, is it? 35, 40, no connection. Neither is himself, his forefathers, family. There was no connection with farming. And the desire to understand farming from first principles, it's like a scientific attitude. So therefore, deliberately he chose to do Koradbahu, dryland farming, and of course ended up using almost all of his savings gave up his very sort of comfortable and cushy job in Switzerland. He lived in Switzerland for 8 years. You know, sometimes I like to mention uh, the person whom we know as Swami Vivekananda is because he went to Chicago. Until then, he was kind of anonymous, uh, no-name monk, wandering monk. But Chicago, we know him as Swami Vivekananda. And he gave that famous speech in September 1893, and he died in 1902. When it was 9 years, we know Swami Vivekananda through his writing. He actually never wrote anything. Mostly it's his speeches. He wrote letters. He wrote some, but there are 8 volumes of his very voluminous literature. Most of it is actually speeches and his somebody the person who wrote it down is sort of, you can say, scribe or a steno, was the great J.J. Goodwin, an Irish person. So the point is that Swami Vivekananda's life we know because of those 9 years, but 5 out of the 9 years were spent abroad, in America and Europe, Japan. 5 out of 9 years Swami Vivekananda was not in India. So I think, I'm not drawing a parallel to Sharad Joshi, but the 8 varsha, those 8 years in Switzerland is not a small period. And so the second aspect I want to mention, apart from this empathy and keeping your word in Kolhapur, is that wanting to learn farming from the first principles. And I think because he attended so many seminars and poverty workshops on poverty alleviation in the UN system, he was actually struck by the institutional shallowness. Ki kaya apn cha coffee pito and we study seminars, but is anything happening to poverty? And therefore, he was restless. He wanted to be in public life. He wanted to come and really participate. But then the big understanding is that India's poverty is mostly confined to rural areas. You may not agree today because there is urban poverty, not to deny that. But largely India's poverty problem has been confined to rural areas. And within rural areas, the poverty is mostly in agriculture. So basically, if you want to look at issues of development and poverty eradication, you cannot ignore agriculture. And therefore he said, okay, let me study this thing from scratch. So that's a very scientific attitude. I just want to read, with your permission, I'll take only 50 minutes of tea. So I want to read how he started. So basically, this is something many of you know about it, but I thought I should read this, what is this India's history, the fact that we had this poverty problem. It's related to what Pradeep Apne just now said. He of course was quoting Stalin, and but that Stalinist kind of Soviet planning has influenced Indian thinking also. For good or bad, we don't know, but I just want to say that India's industry-led development in the earlier years, since independence, aimed at keeping wage goods cheap, that is, food prices should be low to benefit industry, because industrialization was the need of the hour. He called it in a little more graphic and provocative language, saying if we don't have colonies to exploit, we must exploit farmers. But without using as a Prakshobhak Bhasha, but basically the idea of planning was that we need to keep food prices, the wage goods, economists call it wage goods. So wage goods should be cheap, food prices should be low for the sake of industrialization. But this meant giving lower remuneration to farmers by design. And to offset this handicap of low output prices for agriculture, we had an elaborate mechanism to keep input prices low. Farmers are to be handicap karta hai, so keep the input prices also low. What is this? Input prices low means kya hai? This is a classic Soviet style planning, central planning. Ki inputs were subsidized: fertilizer, electricity, credit, water. And to this day, we are still struggling to get out of that subsidy maze. To this day, till now. Joshi is gone, but we are still struggling. Since there are no quantity constraints on this subsidy, nor is the subsidy linked to poverty. The subsidy is not linked to poverty. We are trying to do that, targeting subsidy, but it's not linked to poverty. It gets cornered by larger farmers. Even the minimum support price system tends to benefit those with a larger marketable surplus. But Joshi's insight was deeper, and he wasn't just thinking of tinkering with the cost and price formula. He realized that it was not enough to demand higher output prices. The whole statist system had to be dismantled. This complicated central planning, unless this was dismantled, This is not going to get the farmer free. Whether it's Ayn Rand or Adam Smith, we won't get into that today. I don't think we have time. We should organize a seminar for this. But basically, unshackling the farmer, हे जे आहे त्याला त्यांच्या बंदीतनं बाहेर काढा. To this day, we are trying to unshackle the farmer. What does this mean? It means remove the shackles of the Essential Commodities Act, doing away with compulsory procurement. In Vidarbha, they are rich in minerals, but minerals are under state government control, central government. They are rich in cotton, but cotton became ekadikar procurement. So everything that was advanced. No wonder Vidarbha is so backward. So unshackling meant doing away with compulsory procurement, allowing tenancy farming, improving credit flow to agriculture, legitimizing money lenders with proper regulation, enabling direct contact of buyers and sellers, including contract farming, removing export controls, and allowing derivatives and speculations. As I said, so 8 commodities, the future state. All these ideas, this is a person, a radical thinker. This is he figured it out, I think, by himself. So, and these 3 farm laws, by the way, I don't know if you have time to discuss that. I will tell you, if it is true, I agree with Professor Apteki, as the germ is all there in Joshi's thinking. But, the government just simply twisted everything. If I can spend 1 minute on this. The first law said that you don't have to go through the mandi. You can sell anywhere. But they didn't tell us that what was hidden is that mandi is going to be completely withered away. But in the meantime, what is the transition path? At least if the mandi la assurance, we know that MSP works there. So if you're going to do it, tell us that. So it's not the freedom to sell outside the mandi, but tell us the roadmap. Number one. Second, they said that no Essential Commodities Act is gone. No storage limits. And in the same day, September 2020, when the law was passed, in the same week, they put export ban on the onions going into Bangladesh, Calcutta border. Almost the same day. So it is like speaking, speaking to completely contradictory things. And now all these export bans are exactly the opposite. On one hand, you are saying that it's going to be, there is no storage limit, no price control mechanism, but almost in the same week. The third law said, so the first law was about freedom to sell outside the mandi. The second law said that freedom no storage constraint, no price control. And the third law says that freedom to contract. Anybody can sell, any farmer can contract with anybody. Right? But contract disputes are the kind. What happens if any contract has to specify what happens with the dispute? Then they said, no, if there is a dispute, you cannot go to court. The farmer has no access to courts. So, you might as well not call it liberalization. So, anyway. So Joshi advocated capitalist-style joint stock companies owned by farmers to do value-added farming, agro-processing, owning a substantial part of this farm to fork value chain. So I think we have seen that from the 1980s. He wasn't simply a thinker who could articulate, but also someone who was able to mobilize millions of farmers. This really fantastic episode and wonderfully described in the book. I think at that time, Kiti local jail 90,000. This is a world record, I think. 90,000 farmers all in jail, and none of them are able to afford the bail to come out. So the spontaneously lawyers from Mumbai and Pune rushing to pay the bail. So this episode, but therefore that was the Joshi. I don't know how, he was not really a very charismatic speaker, I must say, whatever I have seen. But he could mobilize millions of farmers, transcending the lines of caste, language, and religion. And that was, in fact, he was an articulate leader who could break complex concepts into simple statements to provide the intellectual horsepower to the farmers' movement. This Pradeep Apte also said, "Bhik nako grama se dam hai." Just, of course, you can quibble about what is remunerative. We want remunerative prices, but remunerative means kya hai? But this is not the time to go into that. But basically, bhik nako. Amala grama se dam. It almost sounds like a Marxist slogan. Adi gyu. Amala dya, grama se dam dya. Give us the toil. Give us the cabinet for the toil, for our toil and labor, and then later on he modified by saying, we will take it. We will take this thing of our sweat and toil. So in an indirect way, it was an advocacy of removal of state controls for introducing market principles, fair pricing. Of course, critics of Joshi, there were many critics of Joshi. They were used to leftist side state solutions. Left code right on my name, but I'm just saying that there were a lot of critics of Joshi and who said that he was blind to the caste and social oppression in village life. By ignoring that, I'm not sure that is a fair criticism, but some of his leftist critics said that. And but Joshi's liberalization actually a strand. Actually, that thought goes back to the Swatantra Party of Rajagopalachari. In fact, he associated himself with Swatantra Party. And also, some of his critics, his attempt to enter political life led to the splintering of the Sangatana. I think Kshatriya Sangatana, there was a huge debate. Why did he accept this compromise of getting into Rajya Sabha or wherever? But that's why he's a complex person. Apparently, he once said, "I'm not a nice person to know." Kushwant Singh sir, with family, I'm not a nice person to know. He said that. Anyway, so I think basically, all these ideas are very, very relevant today. We may not have, I don't know what is the status of statistics on farmer suicide. Basically the suicide of a farmer is like the Project Tiger. Why do we protect the tiger? Because if the tiger is healthy, it means that the flora fauna is also doing well. He can hear deer or other animals. If that means that ecosystem is good, means they have enough greenery and grass and vegetation. So when you take care of the tiger, you are actually taking care of the entire pyramid. Tasat hai. A farmer's suicide means it is just a tip. There's many things going wrong. So it's not like sensationalizing the suicide, but basically we are not still out of that. And so I just want to say that this is of course I'm very happy and I can't express how thankful I am that I got to meet Mr. Bharat about 6 years ago, I think. And one small just to conclude, since farm policy is open, but his earliest encounter was that in his magazine Antarnath, Mr. Joshi wrote this famous article in 1999. What was the title of the article? Bus Karai Samaj Sevesa Donga. So I just tell you what I understand. So, and this by the way, this conversation came up very recently, just 2-3 days ago. So it's still relevant after this 20-30 years. It was about Baba Amte and it was about Kushtarog, leprosy, doing work for leprosy and selfless and all that. So it was almost heretical to question somebody of the stature of Baba Amte. And he was saying, hey, what is this? But his point was that why don't we go to the fundamentals? Why don't we question that? Now we are in the 75th year of India. When I mentioned Baba Amte, somebody else told me, "Tumhala he Patrodhan Madhya Pradesh mein." Shivaji Rao Patrodhan. Just because Baba Amte was, Shivaji Rao Patrodhan also has hundreds and thousands of Kushtarogan Madhya Pradesh mein. So the same thing, I was reminded of Sharad Joshi. He said, question the fundamentals. Why after 75 years of independence you have leprosy in India? It is thanks to leprosy and widespread leprosy patients that you have social workers with selfless workers. I don't want to get into it, it's a very complex debate. But only somebody of the stature of Joshi can question and make you think about really fundamentals. So he got to the fundamentals of everything. So that's a great tribute. So please read the book. It's a fantastic book. Thank you.
Now I will request Bhanu to respond and to make his own comment on as to why he and how he wrote. Those who have not read the book will be enlightened by that. We have read the book, so we are aware of the intention, the import, the content, the style, everything.
One thing I must mention, see, I'm here on the dais as the Vice Chancellor of Gokhale Institute. Okay, so sorry, I want to mention this. So let me just quote directly from the book. So he was interested in UPSC. He would have been, unfortunately, India, or maybe fortunately for India, he didn't get into IAS or IFSC. And but before he joined, so he actually got into the services, but he didn't make it to the top 3, and therefore the Indian Postal Service were. but I'm reading from the book. Before he joined, another opportunity knocked at the door. He was offered a scholarship to do research at the prestigious Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics in Pune. And the prospect of doing research in this area of his choice was quite tempting. But while discussing the offer in personal meeting with Dr. Dhananjay Rao Gadgil, the founder director of Gokhale Institute, a renowned economist and vice chairman of Planning Commission, Gadgil said, at the end of research, you would basically end up being a professor. But the job of a civil servant is more important than that of a professor. So ultimately, the task of implementing policies is not in the hands of the professor, but the civil servant. So civil servant is an important medium of changing society and not a professor. So Joshi was convinced that Gokhale Institute was not for him. So.
I don't know where to begin, but I want to thank all the dignitaries on the stage for their comments, and I'm of course, like most of you, waiting for Kumar Ketkar to share his views. I'm also thankful to my old friend Pradeep Vaidya, whose father, Abhay Vaidya, whose father actually was a good friend of mine and used to write for our monthly magazine Antarna. I would also like to mention some of my friends like Dr. Dattaprasad Dabholkar, who have come all the way from Satara just to attend this function. No other engagement in Pune. Wants to return immediately after the function. So I'm grateful for this affection of so many people who are here. A writer is supposed to speak through the pages of the book. And I don't think anything in support of what I've written is expected. But Abhay Vaidya was keen that I speak for at least 10 minutes to explain to the audience why I wrote that book, what I expect to come out of it. I came in close touch with Sharad Joshi in 1999 when we had a Diwali issue dedicated to the theme Swayamspurta Karyate Samaja Jivanatil Sthan. All the other 7 writers of the Diwali issue were prominent social workers themselves. And Sharad Joshi's treatment of the subject was very much detrimental to all that they stood for. To the extent that I was in double mind how I can carry an article like that with the kind of readership Antarnath had especially, whether it will be digested by them. So we deleted all the proper nouns and names of the organizations and carried the article still. But that proved to be quite controversial. And in the process, I was enamored by the man himself. I'm not an agriculturist, nor an economist. But as a writer, I'm an observant of human nature. Why people do what they do, why people think what they think, what are the influences of childhood, their upbringing, that makes them what they are. And in that perspective, when I began to think of Sharad Joshi, I thought that this is a subject of deeper research, introspection. When I broached the topic of his biography, he was dead against it. But I managed to convince him because of the 2 reasons I had in mind before writing this biography. The first was, I pointed out to him that most of the media has not painted the right picture of what he stood for. I gave him an example of P. Saina's well-known book, Everyone Loves a Good Route. A big book, several hundred pages, but there is not even one sentence about Sharad Joshi or about Shetkari Andolan. I also gave him example of another book, India After Gandhi. Very nice book. Kumar Ketkar's wife has translated it. But there also, only 4 or 5 sentences about Sharad Joshi's Andolan are there, linking him to the likes of Mahendra Singh Tikait. And I felt that rather unfair. because the followers of Sharad Joshi whom I had interacted with, like Badrinath Devkar, who is here, who happens to be my neighbor, a farmer from Kopargaon, and many such people, I thought that they were certainly not the kind of kulaks that some critics have made them out to be. And I felt that has to be rectified. Secondly, I felt that much of what is stood for has relevance even for the modern times. And therefore, I suggested to him that there is no biography of yours. There are books published in your name, but they are basically the compilation of articles that you wrote for Shetkari Sangatak. 99% of what is published appeared as articles in Shetkari Sangatak first, which were written, the articles were written for a particular andolan, particular education, etc. But a comprehensive biography of his, the day he was born, his education, everything needed to be written. With a lot of persuasion, he agreed. And in the process, when I began to meet him, I used to meet him every Friday generally. He did one wonderful thing. He called a meeting of his Shetkari Sangatana Karyakarini at his home. He made me speak to them, and he published a one full page request through Shetkari Sangatak to all his followers to give me whatever material they could get on him, any letters, photographs, etc. Because in one moment of dejection, frustration, Sharad Joshi had destroyed all his personal papers. There was very little available with him. And to reconstruct that entire period was not an easy task. Someone like Sureshandra Matre, who is also here, was a great help to me. Badrinath Devkar was a great help to me. We could travel to many places together. Many of his followers helped very generously with their time and material. And ultimately we managed to get enough on which to write the article. Two particular periods of his life, fairly longish. 10 years in Indian Postal Service, immediately after marriage, and 8 years in Switzerland. They were like tunnels. He never wrote anything about those years. In fact, he told me a couple of times that since he had decided to break from the past, he never wanted to refer to his past life. And he used to say in Marathi, Nadita mood and Ushita kud, kadibaguni. Which is okay, understandable. But I think when you write a biography, you can't leave 18 years of period untouched. And that was the most difficult part of this biography. But after about 4 to 5 years of work, I managed to complete it. I remember he was so reluctant to talk of past. He once said to me, nothing is sweeter than the smell of the burnt bridges. Nothing is sweeter than the smell of the burnt bridges. Implying that when he broke the links with the past, he felt relieved, happy, and he didn't want to return to those days, even in discussion. But with some difficulty, we managed to get certain things out of him. We had to do a lot of cross-checking, etc. One thing that has been mentioned earlier by Professor Pradeep Apte about his transformation from agitational approaches to subsequent constructive approaches, what he himself would call Angaratun Jyotikari, from a spark to the flame. That portion also was not easy. Ultimately, the biography was written in December 2016. It was published. And all the speakers who were present that day, I think Sadanand More was there, Vinay Sahasrabudhe was there, Dr. Prasad Dhavolkar was there. Many of them, they said that a book like this has to come out in English also. for a variety of reasons, which I wouldn't go into now, that got delayed. But I'm glad that at last now the biography has been published. And I hope that it will serve as a documentation for future historians, students, journalists, and others. Because unless you write something authentic, something based on actual interviews, where you can give references, references, it is very difficult to evaluate an idea or a man, say 50 years from now on. So from that perspective, this documentation was an important aspect for me. That was the first thing I wanted to talk about. Why I wrote this book. The second thing I wanted to mention was about this title, The Man Who Introduced Bharat to India. Now this division of Bharat and India is not that way. He put it in a very unique way, but the substance of it has not been totally new. I remember in 1965, I was 12 years of age, a student in Mumbai. The first skyscraper of Mumbai came up, Usha Kiran, 26 stories. And I still distinctly remember photographs of Usha Kiran, and next to that, slums that were built along the slopes of Mumbai, contrasting the richness and the poverty. This kind of presentation, of course, Sharad Joshi would have known. But I want to tell you how we came about this idea of India versus Bharat. Why we chose this title for this discussion, A Man Who Introduced Bharat to India. His both daughters were studying in St. Joseph's Convent at Pashan. For 8 years, they have studied in French medium. Even at home, they used to speak in French. For them to shift to Pune against, to be honest, their own wish, was an ordeal. And they somehow were coping up with it, as was his wife, Bilatai. There was a function in St. Joseph's Convent, what they call annual day, when all the parents of the students were also invited. And Sharad Joshi was observing that for the first time after returning to India, he could see the smiles on the faces of his daughters. They were enjoying that evening. But in his mind, he was thinking about all the chubby, happy, well-to-do students around him, their parents, students taken straight from the ads of Horlicks or Cadbury. And he suddenly began to think of the young child, a daughter of his land labourer, whom he used to teach in his spare time at Ambedhan. And at night he could not sleep. In the beginning, for a couple of hours, he was restless, thinking about his own family, what right he had to uproot them from their comfortable existence in Bern. He was feeling sad about it. And then he began to see the differences between the atmosphere in Ambedhan and the atmosphere in St. Joseph's Convent that he was witness to on this annual day, fun fair day, everybody enjoying. And then he said that a road that connects university with NDA, which was in fairly good condition, was entirely resurfaced because the President of India was to travel on that road. Lakhs of rupees were spent. And he remembered, he said that in Ambedhan village, if a pregnant lady has difficulties, to shift her to primary health center, there is not even a road on which bullock cart can go. He saw that majestic, imposing building of St. Joseph's Convent, and he suddenly realized the one room, one teacher school in Ambedhan. And many such things. He realized how these students were spending 100 rupee notes casually on buying some sweets, etc. And now, just a few months ago, he had to sell his onion. It takes 4 to 5 months to grow onion. And he had to sell it for 20 rupees a quintal, 20 paise a kilo. That's what he got from market committee. And he began to see many such contrasts. And that time, this phrase occurred to him that we may have one president, one national anthem, but actually, these are two different nations, Bharat versus India. And he was very emotional when he thought about this. He could not sleep all night. And then he wrote down his thoughts on Bharat India, which was not in the communist concept of class war. He didn't have that kind of a thing, and he was an ardent follower of Iron Man. But we could see that there are two different Indias that exist in this one nation, and what he could do to bridge the gap. He said to me, and he in fact had written also somewhere, that the difference between Bern and Pune was obviously very stark. But he said the difference between Aund and Ambedkar was even greater, even starker. And that was the beginning of his subsequent thinking about getting fair price to the farmers. I would like you to read the book, and therefore there is not much point in elaborating more. Now, there is need for study on agriculture, no doubt about it. There are so many experts in this country. There will be various surveys are being made, etc. But as you all know, you can, if you torture data sufficiently, you can extract any conclusion. You can draw any conclusion that you want. The point is that what is your attitude to all this? And for Sharad Joshi, his dream was to see every Indian farmer free of his loans. And I think what he gave most to the farmers was a sense of self-respect, swabhiman. That's what he wanted to do. He said, we are demanding fair price from the government as the last emergency measure, because we are now in a situation where we have to put on salination. Not salination, what do you call it? Saline. You have to put on a saline. But soon you should be able to stand on your own feet. That was the condition of the farmers in those years. I think it has changed a lot, but in many cases it is still the same. When I went to Nipani, I met some tobacco farmers. And I was asking them what exactly you earned, what you got out of this agitation in which people were killed, shot by the police on a Gudi Padwa day, just a day after Gudi Padwa. And they said, we got our Swabhiman. Earlier, when we used to go to haircutting salon, he will not even allow us to enter, he will make us sit outside. Now he treats us with respect. I think many of you who have been readers of Marathi literature would be familiar with that very famous poem by Kusumagraj called Kana. खिशाकडे हात जातात असं तसं तुटला. I think you must be knowing that. पैसे नको सदर एकटेपणा वाटला. मोडून पडल्या घर पण तुटला नाही कणा, पाठीवरती हात ठेवून फक्त जड. That is exactly what Sharad Joshi wanted. And I think, I'm sorry for getting emotional, but the incident that Ajit Ranade mentioned, I think I would like to say something about it, because when this Marathi book was published, that lawyer was present in the audience, which I was not aware of. In fact, Matre sir told me that lawyer's name is Advocate Daulat Rao Gumre, who is the president, who was then the president of Nashik Bar Association. And he was present in the audience. I was not knowing this. And what had happened in Nashik, there were 30,000 arrests. In Kapashi Andolan, in Wardha area, there were 60,000. Now 30,000 people had to be given bill, they had to make an application, someone has to file their form. Who is going to do that? Because most of the farmers didn't have even 10 rupees on them. That time, Daulat-Rao Bhumre, who was a former communist, he got all the lawyers to get together. They passed a resolution, unanimous, that we will fight all these 30,000 cases without charging 1 naira. I think if you know the legal process in India, it's a miracle that 30,000 cases are fought by the lawyer without charging 1 naira paisa. Generally, a lawyer will not even give a free cup of tea to his client. Here, it's a miraculous thing. So I was quite enamored by many such events. That was the reason for writing this book. And my only hope is that somehow the problems of agriculture, the problems of farmers will become our problems. See, today we keep discussing about some Shivalinga, we keep discussing about some rape, some drug case, we keep discussing about so many issues, Hanuman Chalisa, so many things like that, But I would like people to discuss about issues of agriculture, because if half the country depends on agriculture, how can you create a better India without tackling problems of agriculture? I very much hope that events like this, where I'm in fact impressed that 100 people have gathered here. For 2 years of Corona, we are not used to public functions. I would like to see these events happening in other cities also, and at least all of you should start thinking about agriculture. Every time we have our meal, let us think of the farmer whose labor has produced that meal. I think with these words, I would like to end, because I am as keen as you are to listen to Kumar.
I now invite Mr. Kumar Ketkar to deliver his concluding address.
Well, given the protocol of PIS's strict discipline of driving, Abhay and me have decided, in fact Abhay has decided, I have endorsed, that we are skipping Q&A because that will take a lot of time. Because our experience is most of the Qs are speeches themselves. So anyway, they are intelligent speeches. I don't want to undermine their significance. Anyway, but I'll just make my observations. The tradition is to make observations on observations made by earlier speakers. I will restrict that to, because I think they have given their personal experiences and also theoretical notes. But I just thought after reading the book, who is the man? What is this Sharad Joshi? What is the ideological, political personality DNA of the man? I just was jotting my notes and I wrote this one line which I'll read. I found that it is an enigmatic tragedy of a possessed maverick who arrived like a comet and disappeared in the vast universe of Indian society and Indian polity. Rebellion, there was a film in US, Hollywood, called Rebel Without a Cause. That is not the correct description of this man. But ultimately, why it became closer to rebel with a cause or without a cause is because he has travelled in a very contradictory way. Every man is supposed to be a bundle of contradictions, but Sharad Joshi was intensely a bundle of contradictions. I still do not understand and comprehend or empathize that he joined finally the BJP, got disillusioned there. He joined VP Singh, got disillusioned there. Manmohan Singh invited him for agriculture immediately after becoming Prime Minister, never went beyond that. Indira Gandhi's Prime Minister office responded to him when he wrote about agriculture, nothing went further. So there is a distinct possibility that he turned partly cynical, partly nihilist. Why do I say nihilist? Because the way he burnt his personal papers is an expression of nihilism. And his comment on social workers, I think, was more in the nature of cynicism than in the nature of theoretical understanding of social work. Because I know hundreds of people who were influenced, not in the so-called fashionable NGO social work, but were influenced by Mahatma Phule's work, Dr. Ambedkar's work, who were not doing that kind of social work which he hated or which he thought everything existed. Then there are so many social workers who are promoting science with no particular so-called shown or not so shown compassion or whatever he hated. So I think his cynicism took him and nihilism took him, his personality, and that actually created a problem. Pradeep mentioned about Stalin and those things. I don't want to go into that debate because he was right about observations. But at that point itself, Stalin was opposed by Bukharin and Trotsky and others that you are doing the wrong thing when Stalin began to collectivize farming. When Mao started community farming and so on and abolishing, the first person to oppose him, even after the Long March and after the 1949 revolution, was Deng Xiaoping, who became president, who was arrested by Mao Zedong's people in the Cultural Revolution. Then Deng Xiaoping liberalized the economy. At one point, Sharad Joshi privately said, Deng Xiaoping has learned from me. Now, that I think is a statement right or wrong, but the point is that also explains Sharad Joshi's personality. He was extremely self-absorbed, and that clearly also shows at the end of his life, apart from going first towards BJP, VP Singh, and later on even the idea of Hindutva and so on, not idea of Hindutva as of today, but the idea of Hindu philosophy, and later on turning towards spirituality. The kind of spirituality he practiced or he advocated was a completely different format than what he actually worked for among the agriculturists, among the farmers. So I think that departure from his personal life, ideological life, political life, to salvation thinking, to sakshatkar, and to spirituality was actually an escape from the relative non-comprehension of what was happening. It had gone perhaps beyond his ability to control the situation, because he was a man who wanted to control the situation, who never is defeated. He never liked to be defeated, as Bhanu has written after talking to his friends. And then I realized that his period, 1968 to 1976, when he came back, was the most turbulent period in the world. Like Vietnam War, negotiations were taking place in Geneva, in Paris. He was in Europe at that time. The war, Israel-Arab war was taking place, the oil prices have shot up in 1973. And suddenly the world economy changed. In 1974 here, there was the world's worst drought, which ruined so many nations, including Ethiopia. He does not have, at least in this biography, much of the reference to all the world events as to how he was responding from Europe. And I think that was necessary, perhaps because he did not. I think he lacked, throughout from the book, while the qualities of the book we have mentioned, but I think he lacked what is known as Weltanschauung, the world view. He could not accommodate the world view into his philosophy. That perhaps led him to the notion of his understanding of spirituality. The book does not mention, except as a shadow, his wife, who, as we know, committed suicide. I don't want to be melodramatic about it, his daughters as well as his wife. Nor the book should not be melodramatic. But I think biography, as he said, should cover as much as possible of the life, personal as well as family and social life. I think in next edition he should incorporate that without necessarily being judgmental or melodramatic or falsely emotional. He can write that because she was, from the brief remarks here and there, was an independent personality. She was with him throughout, and sometimes away from him. But I think that aspect is almost like a major film. This book can make into what you can call a profound documentary film of the man who was a maverick and tragedy. I don't want to compare him with Khan Kojes and Emin Roys and so many others who went abroad, but their souls remained here and they made contributions here, but somehow they were global personalities with local perspectives and local understanding and profound understanding with the world view. Amartya Sen has written about famines and droughts and agriculture enormously. I do not see much. Amartya Sen's piece on Chinese agriculture and disappearing women was published in 1973-74 in New York Review of Books. I do not see much Sharad Joshi writing about Amartya Sen's views on agriculture, right or wrong. Amartya Sen, Meghnad Desai, Khan Koje, and many people have turned right. Dinanath Khatkate was a hardcore comrade in the 1950s. He went to US, went to World Bank, not because of World Bank, but he had turned right and became total right. Total right to the extent that he thought Manmohan Singh and Modi are not proper right-wing persons. In fact, he condemned Modi even before, he died soon after that Modi is promoting leftist ideas by talking right. And Khatkate was a friend of Manmohan Singh, but he criticized him for not being adequately right. And the man was a comrade in 1950s, a left-wing comrade, not a so-called right-wing comrade like Comrade Dande, or as he is accused of being right-wing comrade. So point is, in next edition of the biography, we should know about the world view of Sharad Joshi, his family life of generally his wife and daughters, and why he shifted psychologically and sociologically from one end to other end that is essential to understand the man and his mission. Thank you very much.
Just one little point I wanted to clarify, because Kumar Ketkar quite rightly referred to it, about his family life, especially about his wife. It wasn't easy for a biographer to get him to speak about that topic. Little bit he did speak, which the book carries more in Marathi than in English. There is a photograph in the book with Sharad Joshi, his wife Leelatai, and two daughters, Shreya and Gauri, both settled in America now. Shreya and Gauri. One in Canada, elder one is in Canada, younger one is in New Jersey. There was a photograph that was given to me. I don't remember whether it was Vijay Parulkar's wife or who, but I got that photograph. It was printed in the book. And on the back side of the photograph, the date was written that when the photograph was taken. It was a photograph of Sharad Joshi, Leelatai Joshi, and two daughters. And backside, the date is written. And when I was actually doing the writing of the biography, I realized that that was the very day when they had a big fight in the home. And he wanted to go to Wardha for the meeting that Professor Apte spoke about, because it was a meeting of the Kisan Coordination Committee, which he had called, and he had invited personally 30 or 35 leaders from different states, farmers leaders, because he realized that agriculture is a central government issue and had to be tackled at a national level. Because he had called for the conference, he could not possibly get away from it, though Leelatai was telling him not to go, because she said, "I'm not feeling well." But he insisted on going, obviously because he had called a meeting. And that night that tragedy happened, he got the news when he was in the midst of his speech in Wardha, which he completed, and then he rushed back. So all her attempts to readjust with the life in India after spending 8 years in Bern, I've written a few things, like how she started her own poetry and what were the difficulties she had to encounter, and a few things like that. But I think more than that could not be written about his family life, because his both daughters, and they were away abroad, and they had no connection with them. He didn't have much connection with them either. He was basically living alone, supported by 2 or 3 of his colleagues like Anantara Deshpande, who is here, Didi, who is there, Sureshchandra Mhatre, who is here, Badrinath is here. But otherwise, most of his life he was on his own. When he sold part of his land, he for the first time had some money from which he could buy a flat. And the rest of the land he handed over to the trust, which is actually the publisher of this book. But I'm afraid not more can possibly be added to what has already been done.
That is the third dark tunnel which has not been explored anyway, be that as it may.
Thank you. On behalf of Pune International Centre, I extend a hearty vote of thanks to our chairperson this evening, Mr. Kumar Ketkar, who spared time from his busy schedule to grace the occasion. I also thank our speakers. Today we had the opportunity to hear your thoughts, and indeed this was a very engaging discussion. Thank you, Mr. Vaidya, for always encouraging the youth at Pune International Centre to read more, to think critically, and to be the thought leaders for tomorrow. Last but not the least, thank you to Team PIC and to our lovely audience for making this event a success. With that, on behalf of Pune International Centre, I invite you to our next event, a webinar on the turmoil in Sri Lanka. The chairperson for this event will be Ambassador Sudhir Devare, former Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, ICWA, and member Pune International Centre. The speaker will be Ambassador Rajendra Abhyankar, Indian Ambassador to the EU, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and member Pune International Centre. This event will be online and registrations are open online. This event will be held on Wednesday, 8th of June from 6 p.m. to 7:15 p.m. Thank you everyone. Have a great evening.